Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a discussion with respect to the announcements of reciprocal tariffs by United States President Donald Trump and its possible consequences on the world with specific reference to India. Then, in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the increasing menace of chemical disasters in the country and its impact on human life, environment, and property. Then, in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2025 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of the day, this is with respect to Trump, tariffs, and turmoil, a new world disorder. In 1987, Donald J. Trump authored a book, The Art of Deal, which obviously many say was not written by him. That book talked about his business acumen. And that was the very business acumen which he applied in his first presidential term, which started in 2017 till 2021, where he talked about America first. And in his second presidential term, which started in 2025, he talked about Make America Great Again. Now, all these things highlight the rise of economic nationalism in US. And in that line, Mr. Trump has imposed reciprocal tariffs on its trading partners, which range to the tune of 10% to 49%. And he has not even spared India. And he has imposed almost 27% tariffs on Indian exports to US. Now, what we'll talk about today is we'll see what world order is all about and what are the policies of Donald J. Trump, which basically highlight towards the economic nationalism and what impact it can have on the world, including India, and what can be the way forward. Now, this is with respect to GS2, effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests. Now, let's first talk about the very important word which we all must have heard, that is the world order. What do we mean by world order? See, in specific terms, world order, it signifies the distribution of power and authority among different nations. That is, what amount of power and authority is vested with different countries around the world and how it is being exercised. Now, it is this power, it is the distribution of the power which basically shapes the interaction among different countries, the management of conflict between different countries, among different countries, and the cooperation on different areas, be it the climate change, be it the world health, be it terrorism, right? Now, please understand that this concept of world order, it encompasses various structures, it encompasses various norms, what we call as sometimes rules-based order, and it also encompasses various principles, which nations are expected to abide. Now, once nations follow this, it determines the behavior of different countries and international institutions. So we have different institutions, for example, say the United Nations or World Trade Organization. So it also determines the functioning of different international organizations, including different nations. Now, let's talk about the chronology in which the world order developed, right? How this world order came into being. Now, if I were to go into the pre-World War era, please understand that this concept started its inception, right? So it was primarily in the 19th century when different European powers, they came up with this concept of balance of power, right? And if I talk about a specific event which basically came up with this world order, it was the Congress of Vienna of 1815. Now, we all know that we had the formulation of the League of Nations to prevent conflicts, but it ultimately failed because it failed to basically stop the First World War. Now, then what happened was that we had the United Nations, the formation of United Nations in the course of Second World War. And also, we had the Bretton Woods Conference. Now, the Bretton Woods Conference was responsible for the formulation of 2 very important organizations. So we had the institutionalization of 2 very important organizations. The very first is International Monetary Fund, and the second is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, commonly referred to as World Bank. Now, what you must understand is that from 1947 onwards till 1991, what we saw was a bipolar world order. Bipolar means 2 poles. apart, opposite from each other. And these two poles were led by United States on one end and USSR on the other. Now, please understand, it was the US which talked about the principles of liberalism, which talked about the principles of democracy. On the other hand, we had USSR, which talked about the principles of communism. Now, see, please understand that this phase of bipolar world order, it saw the formation of different military alliances in the form of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and Warsaw Pact. Also, it saw that there was the rise in proxy wars. For example, the Vietnam War. For example, the Korean War. Now, what you need to understand is that in these wars, these two countries did not participate directly. They did not confront directly, but they basically helped the opposing parties. So, what we call as the proxy wars. Now, again, this period also saw the proliferation of nuclear arms, right, which ultimately resulted into nuclear race. Now, it was in 1991 when we saw the disintegration of the erstwhile USSR. And then what we saw was the rise of the unipolar world order led by the United States of America. Now, it was this phase after 1991 when the United States basically emphasized upon the neoliberal globalization, where United States said that there has to be the reduced role of the state. There has to be free market economics. There has to be free trade among different countries. Now, what we saw that it was in 2001. Now, you need to tell me what was that event which actually marked a black spot on US hegemony. And that event happened in 2001. Then we had the global financial crisis in 2007. Now, what we witnessed from 2000 onwards was the aggressive rise of China. And then we witnessed in 2007-2008 was the global financial crisis, which drastically changed the world order. Now, one thing which I would like to specify here is that it was in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization, and that too on America's insistence. What it led to was the aggressive rise of China, and not just China, but the rise of other countries. For example, we had Brazil, we had Germany, we had Japan, we had Russia. And it is in that context that a very famous economist, Jim O'Neill, coined the term BRIC, right? Where he said that these four countries, Brazil, India, China, and Russia, are going to dominate the world economy by 2050. It is in that regard that the world order changed from the unipolar world order to the multipolar world order. Now, what multipolar world order means is that we have different poles, and there are different poles having different powers. One thing which you should understand is that this period also talks about the geopolitical rivalries, primarily between the US and the China, what we call as the Cold War 2.0. Geopolitical rivalries in different domains, be it military, be it technology, be it the other strategic areas, for example, the critical minerals. Also, what we are witnessing is the drastic and sudden rise in the technological advancements. Take the case of 5G, and now we are switching to 6G. Take the case of quantum computing. Take the case of semiconductors. Take the case of space exploration. So what we are witnessing is that there is primarily the competition between the US and China in these realms, in these domains. Now, one thing which you must know is that US has tried to shift from a free market paradigm to one where it is standing for the protectionist measures. That is, it is now vouching for economic nationalism, as we are witnessing in the policies of Donald Trump, right? And that which we saw in his America First slogans, and also Make America Great Again. Also, it's not just America. Please understand, there are different countries around the world. Take, for example, we have the rise of far-right parties in Europe, Germany, France. Or take, for instance, the European Union's coming up with new initiatives. Let's say the Carbon Border Adjust Mechanism, CBAM. See, again, we understand that what they are saying is that it is primarily to protect the environment. But one of the hidden agenda is to basically hamper the competitive advantage of different countries. For example, India, right? So that is something which you must focus upon. Now, let's talk about what are reciprocal tariffs. What do we mean by reciprocal tariffs? See, let's say we have US, right? And a country A is exporting something to US. And then US is also exporting something to A. But US is not imposing too much of tariffs. But this country A is imposing, let's say, 50% tariffs on US commodities. Now, what US is saying is, we will also impose similar tariffs on your products which are coming to us. That is what reciprocity is all about, reciprocal tariffs. So in specific terms, what reciprocal tariffs means? US would impose the same tariff rates on imports from other countries as they impose on US goods. It's nothing but just a form of tit for tat. Now, what Trump is saying is that these measures are primarily to correct the trade imbalances. See, please understand, one thing which I would like to specify here is that US as a country, it's a very strong manufacturing base, primarily because of its technological advancements, which make its manufacturing quite efficient, which other countries find difficult to match. Now, once US exports something, a product to different countries, definitely the other countries are in danger, right? Because their domestic industry would suffer, and therefore they basically impose huge tariffs on US products. And considering that, what Trump is saying is that you are imposing X amount of tariff on my products. Why can't I impose the similar tariffs? It is not my fault that you are competitively not as advantageous as us, or you are not able to match our quality. It is not my fault. So that is what Trump is saying. Again, what you must understand is Trump is emphasizing on this part, saying that I have to correct these trade imbalances. I'm not imposing tariffs on your product. So why are you imposing tariffs on my products? The very objective is to reduce the trade barriers against the US exports to different countries around the world. What is the rationale? What is the reason? The very first is trade deficit concerns. In 2020 itself, the trade deficit with respect to the goods in the US, it amounted to almost 912 billion US dollars. Can you just imagine? 912 US billion dollars. This is a very huge amount, and therefore Trump is trying to rectify it. Next is unfair trade practices, as I've just told you. What Trump is saying is that different countries are not following fair trade practices. I am not imposing that much amount of tariff as you are imposing on my products. So this is something which is not acceptable. Next is domestic manufacturing. What Trump is trying to do is, Trump is trying to give impetus to the domestic manufacturing. Initially, US was a global powerhouse with respect to manufacturing. Then slowly, as the cost of manufacturing increased in the US, the companies, they basically transitioned to different countries around the world, primarily China, right? Now, what we say is that China is the powerhouse, manufacturing powerhouse of the world. What Trump is trying to say is that because of this switch of manufacturing base to other countries, be it China, be it India, be it Vietnam, there is the decreased job opportunities in the US. And I have to basically I have to give impetus to the domestic manufacturing in the US so that there can be adequate jobs, right? Also, what he's trying to emphasize is job for Americans. See, we know that US is a country of immigrants. Many of the Indians, right, they have gone to US and now they occupy very good positions. Now, what Trump is saying is that there are people, I understand, I'm not saying that you don't come, but again, you'll have to give benefits to the US economy. And as a president of this country, I have to basically give or provide resources to my domestic audience, and that too in the form of jobs for Americans. Next, what he says is that the WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, they are unfair. That is, they are giving preference to some specific countries. What he's saying is, I understand that you have classified different countries as developed, developing, and least developed, and you are giving preference to developing and least developed countries. But again, for those countries, for example, what he says is India. India is a country which, according to him, should not be given advantages, right, with respect to different trade measures. So he's saying that these WTO rules are basically unfair and they have to be made more fair. Now, what were the earlier moves which were implemented by the US on different countries around the world? See, it was primarily 2018 and 2020. What we witnessed was the trade war between US and China. What US did was that it said that I'm going to impose tariffs on goods worth 360 billion US dollars which were coming from China to US. In retaliation, what China said, that I am going to impose tariffs on goods worth 110 billion US dollars. 110 US billion dollars of goods coming from US to China, and ultimately it resulted into trade war. Next aspect was that of section 232 of Trade Expansion Act. What is section 232 of Trade Expansion Act of US. Now, what this Trade Expansion Act of US says is that the President of the United States can adjust the imports if the need arises, even through the application of tariffs. That is, if the US President thinks that the imports are affecting the US economy, he can basically impose tariffs. And accordingly, the US President imposed tariffs on steel to the tune of 25% and aluminium to the tune of 10%. Right? Just remember that. Next, see, it was primarily the Obama administration which negotiated a settlement, an agreement, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But after assuming office, Mr. Donald J. Trump, in his very first presidential term, he came out of the TPP. Also, what he did was he changed the configuration of the North America Free Trade Agreement to United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Now, this has stricter terms as compared to NAFTA. And it basically incentivizes the US production, domestic manufacturing. Also, US has been reluctant to appoint the judges in the WTO's appellate body, which is primarily responsible for dispute settlement and conflict resolution. Also, what you must understand is, it was in 2019 when the President of US basically revoked India's generalized system of preferences. So India used to get some preferences in the form of less tariffs on the trade, right? But what happened was that the US President revoked India's GSP status, and it affected India's exports to US, which amounted to almost $6.3 billion US. For example, let's say the auto parts, for example, let's say the gems and jewelry, right? So these were the earlier moves. Now, in this present case, this is a very beautiful infographic provided by the Indian Express as well as the Hindu. Now, in this very first chart, you can see that we have different countries. We have tariffs on US goods, the kind of tariffs which these countries are imposing on US goods, Trump's reciprocal tariffs, and US trade deficit. Take, for example, China. Now, China, tariffs on US goods, it amounts to almost 67%, right? And see, what is the amount of reciprocal tariff which China has said? Donald Trump has said it's going to be 34%. Look at the trade deficit. Too much. So US is suffering a huge trade deficit with respect to China. Now, US trade deficit as a percent of total, it stands to be almost 24.6%. Take the case of India. Now, India imposes almost 52% tariff rates on US products, right, which are coming to India. What Trump has said is we are going to impose 26% tariffs. This is the trade deficit value, right? And this is the percentage. As a percentage, India basically shares 3.8% when we talk about the US trade deficit as a percent of total, right? So you can just have a glimpse through this particular table. Now, also we have in the Hindu, this talks about the India specific case. What it gives us is the top 30 products which were exported by India between the financial year 2019 and financial year 2024. Now, what it says is that these are the commodities from here to here. You can see is, for example, let's take the case of the rice. For example, let's take the case of iron and steel. Take the case of agri and allied goods, take the case of engineering goods. These are not going to suffer much. But again, look at this. So we have these domains, for example, machinery and instruments, for example, the non-ready-made clothes, right? For example, the electronic goods, for example, the ready-made garments, for example, the gems and jewelry, drug formulations, pearls and stones. They are going to be subjected with huge tariffs, and they are going to affect India's exports to the US. You can have a glimpse through that. Quite an interesting and informative infographic. Now, what can be the consequences? Now, if I talk about the global consequences, the very first is that it would erode the principles of multilateralism. See, US as a country, initially it stood for rules-based order. It stood for international institutions following a particular set of orders. What it said was that there has to be a particular order, and all the nations, all the countries and international institutions must abide by that. But now what it is doing is it is now resorting to unilateral sanctions or unilateral tariffs. That is going to basically erode multilateralism. I hope this is clear, right? So again, understand, we have, for example, World Trade Organization. According to the World Trade Organization, the tariffs imposed by the US President under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, they are not right. They are not in line of the kind of trade fairness principles or free market economics, right? Next is that it is going to affect the dispute resolution mechanisms between different countries, because now US is resorting to unilateral mechanisms. How would the disputes be solved now, right? That is a question mark. Also, what we are basically seeing is that now there's a shift from this multilateral to this aspect of bilateral mode. That is, now Trump is going to emphasize upon specific deals with different countries. He's not going to basically be dependent on different international institutions, be it World Trade Organization. He's going to ask different countries that, see, this is the kind of deal which I want to have with you, right? Next is the rise of trade protectionism. This is what we are witnessing, right? What we call as the economic nationalism. If US imposes tariffs on different countries, again, it is a natural fact that the other countries would also impose a retaliatory tariffs, which even in today's article, China is talking about, which even European Union is talking about, that we are also going to impose the retaliatory tariffs on the US, right? Again, this can lead to global trade war. As an example, what you must know is when the US imposed tariffs on goods which were coming to China, which were worth almost 360 billion US dollars, China also imposed tariffs on US products coming to China, they amounted to almost 110 billion US dollars. This is the example which is provided. Next aspect is disruption in the global supply chains. See, please understand, in the kind of global economic setup we have, products are not manufactured in a specific place. What I mean to say is every product has some intermediate goods, and they are sourced from different countries around the world, right? And for that, we need to have a very efficient global supply chain. But what we are saying is that if US is coming up with these tariffs, definitely it is going to affect the global supply chain, and it is going to affect specific sectors. For example, the automotive sectors, for example, the electronics, be it the semiconductors, for example, the engineering goods, be it the heavy machineries, right? Also, what you must understand is these are the sectors which are critically dependent on global supply chains. For example, let's say you have a particular iPhone. Now, the iPhone has various components. For some of the components, it is dependent on China. For some of the components, it is dependent on, for example, South Korea. For some of the components, it is dependent on Japan. So again, if US is going to impose tariffs on these products, definitely there can be a rise in the cost of these intermediate goods. And ultimately, it would affect the final price of the goods. And this would make the final price less affordable for the end consumers. Next aspect is slower economic growth. See, we had this trade war, which started primarily in 2018 and ended in 2020, almost. It has not completely ended, but again, still. By 2020, what the International Monetary Fund has said, by 2020, because of these trade wars, there was loss to the global economy to the tune of 0.8% of the global GDP. You will say 0.8% of the global GDP is not something which is quite high. But in absolute terms, it amounts to almost $700 billion. Can you imagine? Just because of trade war between US and China, it had loss to the tune of almost 700 billion US dollars, global GDP. Then also, World Bank in its report of 2023 has said that, see, the trade war, it almost ended in 2020 with respect to China and US. But now, still now we have the residual impact, and different countries are suffering because of that. Next is currency volatility and financial market uncertainty. What happens is, as also featured in today's article, whenever you have such news coming from the US or any country, any dominant country, be it China or other, even European Union, what happens is it affects the financial markets. It basically makes these markets volatile. And ultimately, it is the end consumer whose interests are basically lost, right? So it leads to the speculations in the market. And it then, what ultimately leads to is the capital flight, primarily from the emerging markets. So there is a flight of the capital, flight of the money from the emerging economies, let's say India, let's say China, to again back to US, right? And this can lead to currency instability. This we also saw in that period of 2018 and 20, when there was the depreciation of yuan. And again, what it led to was the Chinese authorities then devalued their currency so as to make their exports more competitive, right? It led to ultimately the currency war. Now, what can be the effect on India? The very first is export uncertainty. See, there are certain sectors. Look at this particular graph. So in this particular graph, what you can see is close to 37% of India's marine product exports went to the US, the highest among India's top 30 products in this period. Or take, for example, gems and jewelry, or take, for example, drugs. So again, if US is going to impose tariffs on these products, it is going to affect some specific sectors. These sectors are pharmaceuticals, textiles, auto parts, steel, aluminium, gems and jewelry, right? Also, the case in point is 2019, the revocation of India's GSP status. It affected the India's goods, India's exports to the US to the tune of almost $6.3 billion, right? Next aspect is WTO disputes and bilateral frictions. See, already India many a times has submitted complaints and grievances to WTO, right, with respect to US tariffs on its products. Again, what we are witnessing is there can be a possible retaliation. And in fact, Ministry of Commerce has also given a hint that there can be a possible retaliation on US exports to India, right? What it would lead to is the straining of strategic partnership. See, again, understand, we both are democratic countries, right? And you can also see from the image that how good the relations are. But what we are seeing is that there are certain very important elements which Donald Trump is serious about. And that is trade aspects, right? Now, if US is going to impose tariffs on India's goods, definitely it is going to have an impact on the strategic partnership. Take, for example, Quad. Or take, for example, the Indo-Pacific Partnership, Economic Framework, right? IPEF for prosperity. That is going to have effect. The imposition of tariffs is going to have an implicit effect on these partnerships, Quad or IPEF. Next is loss of policy space. See, India, especially after the COVID-19, we have been emphasizing upon Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, where we are focusing upon the domestic manufacturing base, making a robust and strengthened base in the country, manufacturing base in the country. And for that, we need to protect our industries. Now, if you have the imposition of tariffs on Indian products to US, and if the US would ask India that please lower down your tariffs, definitely it is going to have an effect on the domestic manufacturing. So that is a very critical issue. Opportunity in trade diversification. Now, this is also a good opportunity, right? So what we say is that in times of turmoil, you should also look out for opportunities. What we are trying to say is that this US-China trade tensions, which primarily is between US and China, obviously the US president has now expanded to different countries, but primarily it is US-China. India can utilize its position as an alternative manufacturing hub. And this is also being manifested. For example, Samsung. Take, for example, Samsung has established one of the largest mobile manufacturing units, smartphone manufacturing units in Noida, right? Apple is also investing in its plant, in its domestic manufacturing in India itself. So this is a good news. Next is impact on farmers and MSMEs. See, India is one of the countries which exports a lot of organic products to US, right? One of the largest consignments of organic products from India goes to US, right? If you have US imposing tariffs on India's products, that is definitely going to affect the agriculture goods exports to the US. For example, shrimp or mangoes or rice, basmati rice is one of the commodities which is quite required in the US, right? And this would hurt Indian farmers. Next aspect is MSME. See, this is a very important point. Micro, small and medium enterprises are basically the backbone of Indian economy, the lifeblood of Indian economy. And they contribute substantially to the overall Indian economy and also substantially to the exports, Indian exports, almost to the tune of 40 to 45%. Look at this graph. So we have the contribution in exports to almost touching 50% in the financial year 2019-20 of the MSMEs, right? In the year 2021, it was almost 45%. Also now it tunes to almost 45%. Now, Indian MSMEs, they suffer from various factors. We won't go too much into that aspect. But again, primarily it is because of the lack of credit. There is the technological obsolescence, what we call as technological backwardness, right? There are also issues with respect to social security. So these are some of the issues which make India's MSMEs quite uncompetitive. Now, if you have the imposition of US tariffs on India's exports, definitely it would hamper the overall growth of these MSMEs. That is one of the very important points. Already they are struggling and their position would further drop. Now, what can be the way forward? For the world, the very first is there has to be the reform in the World Trade Organization mechanism. If US is saying, if it is giving a threat that I'm going to come out from US, it doesn't mean that we do not focus upon the WTO reforms. This is the high time where different countries should come together and reinforce and strengthen the overall mandate of the World Trade Organization. Again, we have to incorporate new age issues, for example, the e-commerce, for example, the subsidies, for example, digital trade, right? These are the areas where the WTO should come up with new rules and regulations, what we call as rules-based order. Next is curb arbitrary tariffs. The kind of unilateral tariffs which US has imposed, they should ideally not be imposed, right? Again, US may be right at one instance that other countries, they are imposing, so I should also do that. But countries should not adhere to that, because if all countries would do like that, there would be a trade war and it would affect the whole global economy. And there has to be the adherence to the WTO rules-based order. Again, what we need to focus upon is strengthened conflict resolution and dispute settlement mechanism. So US is not appointing the judges to the appellate body. It should not happen. Next aspect is there has to be the usage of different bodies. Let's say we have G20, different multilateral forums. They should be utilized effectively. G20 commands a very important position when we talk about its share in the global economy, global trade. So these multilateral platforms should be utilized. Next is build resilient supply chains. This is very important. For example, India came up in a partnership, what we call as SCRI, Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. We need to focus upon that. Trust-based multi-country supply chains. And again, we should avoid the concentration risks. What we are saying is we should not be overly dependent upon few countries. Let's say China, right? India is overly dependent on China for some of the very important critical imports. So that should not be there. We should diversify the supply chains. Next is diversify the trade partners. We are talking about India. India should not be overtly dependent upon some specific countries. For example, US. India should diversify its partnership with different countries around the world, right? Let's say we can have strengthened ties with Asia. Also, we have Prime Minister Modi, who is in Thailand for the BIMSTEC, right? So again, what we are trying to say is we need to have more strengthened partnership with different blocks or countries around the world. Take, for example, the European Union, right? Just before a few months, we had the president of the European Union coming to India, European Commission coming to India. So we can basically emphasize upon those partnerships, or African Union or Latin America. Also, we have Central Asia, very important. Central Asian countries, right? They are very rich in critical minerals. So we can come up with new partnerships. We already have Connect Central Asia policy, right? Domestic competitiveness. This is very important. So as I told you that we should emphasize upon having a robust MSME ecosystem, right? So what we can do is we can provide them adequate credit. We can provide them funds for technological upgradation. We can provide them social security benefits. We can make those provisions which can formalize the MSME structure in the country. And that would lead to a more robust structure. We can increase the manufacturing efficiency, and this would make India's industry more globally competitive, right? We have different schemes, for example, the production linked incentive schemes. It can be expanded to further more sectors. Then we have the government of India focusing upon the semiconductors, right? That should be focused upon. Also, the government of India is focusing upon the critical minerals, coming up in partnerships with different countries around the world. That should be focused upon. Utilize the free trade agreements effectively. So what we are trying to say is we already have different FTAs with different countries. We need to utilize that. Also, we need to come up with new FTAs. For example, let's say India can basically come up with an FTA with UK, or for example, European Union, or for example, convert the ECTA partnership with Australia into a more robust framework, right? So that should be done. And this would provide a hedging against the US. Next is strengthened WTO role. So what we are trying to say is, as previously said, that we need to come up with like-minded nations to reinforce the very objective of WTO rules, right? And make sure that there is proper dispute settlement mechanism. There is a robust dispute settlement mechanism. Next, negotiate sectoral deals. That is, we need to focus upon resolving the bilateral irritants. India has had issues with the EU with respect to the intellectual property rights. In fact, also we have this issue with respect to US. So we need to focus upon these specific areas, right? And again, see, we cannot always say that. We already said this for the RCEP, the regional comprehensive economic partnerships, that we are not domestically strong. Our domestic manufacturing would suffer, and that's the reason we cannot join RCEP. But we cannot take this reason for too long. We have to basically make our domestic manufacturing quite competitive. Digital taxation or e-commerce or market access, these sectors need to be focused upon in the bilateral negotiations, and we need to come up with proper solutions. So what we're trying to say is, see, definitely this is not a good news for the world, because if US sneezes, definitely it has effect on different countries around the world. So what we are trying to say is, we need to come up with a proper mechanism. Different countries should come on board, including the US, and come up with a proper mechanism that yes, we should abide by these set of rules, and we cannot have unilateral tariffs, right? Which what US is doing right now. Let's see what the implications would be, but hope for the best and see what happens next. Let's have a mains practice question. Trump's policy of reciprocal tariffs reflects a shift in the global trade dynamics from multilateralism to transactional bilateralism. Critically examine this shift and discuss its possible economic and strategic consequences for India. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, please do not forget to press the like button and also mention in the comment section. Let's go to the next article. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to chemical disasters. So, a very serious incident has happened in the Khandwa district of Madhya Pradesh, where 8 people have died after inhaling toxic gas inside a well. Now, this points towards the loopholes or the issues we have with respect to the management of chemical disasters in the country. Just before a few months, we also had a particular incident in the SEZ of Andhra Pradesh, where almost 17 people died. Also, almost a year ago, we had an incident where in Dombivli, because of the boiler blast, many people lost their life. So this points towards the very important issue of the management of chemical disasters in the country, and this forms a part of GS3 disaster management. Now, see, the industrial chemicals, they form the backbone of the modern industrial manufacturing systems, and they contribute to almost 7% to India's overall gross domestic product. Now, what we basically say is that these industrial disasters which happen, most of the time they are something which are relatively avoidable. But because of various failures, for example, technical failures or human errors, what leads to is these disasters. And they ultimately are responsible for significant loss, be it in terms of the human loss, be it in terms of the loss to the environment, or be it in terms of the loss to the overall property, right? So this is a very important and serious concern. Now we have the National Disaster Management Authority, which comes under the overall jurisdiction of Union Ministry of Home Affairs. This has said in one of its report that there have been almost 130 chemical disasters in the last 1 decade. And this has led to the loss of almost 500 people, the life of 500 people. Now, NDMA, on the basis of the disaster risks, it has basically classified different areas in the country as major accident hazard units, MAH units. So what it has done is, it has come up with a particular list of 1861 major accident hazard units in the country, which cover almost 301 districts. Now this is on the basis of the disaster risk with respect to that particular industry or area. Also, in addition, apart from these units, what you must keep in mind is that we have a plethora, we have a huge number of unorganized sectors, unorganized industries. Also, we have some registered but hazardous factories, which also pose a huge disaster risk, right? So again, understand, this is a very serious concern. Now, what are the causes of chemical disasters in India? The very first is technical failures. See, what happens is that there is a protocol to basically carry out a particular process, but many a times those protocols are not followed. Also, what happens is, let's say there is the requirement of ventilation and proper ventilation is not there, or there's a use of the low quality products in the particular process. So that can lead to the failure and ultimately a disaster. Then we can have human errors. What we are trying to say is, see, in these protocols, in the industrial protocols, what is required is there have to be adequate usage of protective gears, for example, the personal protective equipments. But these workers, they are not given, either they are not given, or sometimes even if they are given, they do not use that. Ultimately leads to the accidents. Then we have hazardous waste processing and disposal. See, many a times as a byproduct, what we have is these hazardous chemicals and gases. Sometimes because of inefficient waste disposal management, or poor waste disposal management, it leads to the leakage of these items into the open environment. and it leads to the disasters. Then induced effect of natural calamities. Let's say you have a particular industry, right? Let's say you have a particular industry. Now in this industry, at this particular place, let's say you have seismic waves, you have the earthquake, and it leads to the breakage of the pipes, sensitive pipes carrying these chemicals. Definitely it can lead to the disaster, chemical disaster. Or let's say there is flooding in this particular area, right? So even these natural calamities can have an indirect consequence with respect to these chemical disasters. Then there can be terrorist attack or sabotage. See, many a times we have some anti-social elements, we have some anti-national elements who basically try to target these establishments, right? Because ultimately what it would lead to is, once these installations are targeted, it would then lead to the loss of human lives, right? And there can be a sabotage. Now, what have been the major chemical disasters in India? So for example, we had the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. In which we had the Union Carbide factory, and there was the leakage of methyl isocyanate. Now this resulted into the instant death of thousands of people, and even to this day many people are crippled, right? So ultimately it is because of the mutations which took place in the genes of the people because of this poisonous gas. Then we have the Chasnala mining disaster of 1975. So we had a particular mine, right? In this mine, what happened is that you had the methane. In the same case, in this particular article, we are also attributing the cause to the methane for the death. Now, this methane ignited and it led to the explosion, and there was a sudden collapse of the mine. It led to the loss of almost 900 people, loss of lives, right? Then we had the Korba chimney collapse of 2009. What happened in this particular disaster is that there was a particular chimney and it collapsed, and it resulted into the loss of life of almost 45 people, right? So this is a very serious issue. Now, what are the legal and regulatory framework in India with respect to chemical disasters? See, we have the Explosive Acts of 1884. We have the Petroleum Act of 1934. We have the Factories Act of 1948. We have the Insecticide Act of 1968. These four statutes, these four laws, they deal with specific sectors. And they also have some general provisions in place so as to minimize the risk of disasters. They have certain guidelines which are to be followed by different domains. For example, we have insecticides manufacturing plants. Or for example, we have petroleum refining units, right? So they have to abide by these principles. Now, I have a question in front of you. We have a particular organization, PESO, Petroleum and Explosive Safety Organization. Right, this is a particular statutory organization, I'm giving you the hint, and it is under the provisions of Explosive Act of 1884 and Petroleum Act of 1934. You need to tell me the department and the ministry under which PESO comes. Very important question. Let me see who answers in the comment section. Now, then we have the Environment Protection Act of 1986. What this particular act does is, it gives the authority to the government, to the union government or the state government, to come up with guidelines so that different industrial units abide by those guidelines. Next, we have Public Liability Insurance Act of 1991. What we are trying to do through this particular law is that we are providing a cushion, we are providing a social security cover to the victims and sufferers of particular accidents, right? So this is very important. Then we have the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010. We all know that this is for expeditious and effective disposal of cases with respect to the environment. Then we have Disaster Management Act of 2005. Very comprehensive law, deal with the pre-disaster aspect, deal with the measures which are to be taken at the time of the disaster, and also the post-disaster management framework, right? So very important rules. Then we have the rules. For example, we have the manufacturing, storage, the import of hazardous chemical rules of 1989, specifically deals with the chemicals. Then we have the chemical accidents rules of 1996. Then we have hazardous waste rules, how to basically manage the waste which is coming out. There have to be a proper protocol with respect to that. Gas cylinder rules, so that there is no explosion with respect to these cylinders, right? Then we have the NDMA guidelines on chemical disaster management. Now, these guidelines, which the NDMA has come up with, they are very comprehensive in nature, and they basically provides the overall direction to various units, be it the central government, be it the state government, be it the local authorities, that how a particular unit has to perform. And these state government or the local authorities are mandated to see whether different industrial units are abiding by those things or not. Based on proactive and participatory approach, multidisciplinary, and it includes various stakeholders, as I said, central government, state government, local authorities, right? Also, we have National Action Plan on Chemicals and Industrial Disaster Management, right? So this must be understood. Now, what should be the way forward to avert and mitigate such disasters? The very first is implementation and efficacy of laws. See, we already have a lot of laws and rules in place. That is not an issue. But the point is, are we implementing it correctly or not? Because sometimes what we see is that there is the illicit nexus between the local authorities and these industrial owners, right? Because they are not really willing. They do not want to invest money on the protective equipments for the laborers, right? So that is an illegal nexus. What we should do is we should basically implement these laws effectively. That is something which is needed. Buffer zones around the factories. There has to be, if you have a particular area and you have a particular industry over here, there has to be something, a buffer zone over here, where no residential setup can be there. Or see, again, what we are saying is that if you have a particular residence over here, definitely if a disaster occurs, it can have a negative consequence on this particular area, right? So there has to be a buffer zone. Regular safety drills and training. What we are trying to say is, the people around such industrial areas or even the workers, they need to be given adequate trainings, adequate safety drills, right? That is really important. Local population must be made aware. This is a very serious concern. Many a times after the disaster happens, what people say is that we were not even aware that such a particular industry existed over here and it was using such a sensitive and such a very, disastrous chemical. So the local people need to be made aware that you have a particular industry and they are using such and such chemicals and processes, right? That is really important. Then safety audits. We need to have a third party safety audit mechanism so that these audits can basically look out and see that, yes, are you abiding by the guidelines or not? And if not, what additions should be made? So that should be there. Retrofitting industrial equipments and storage based on the guidelines of the safety audits. There has to be a retrofitting. That is, after you have the building, the installations, then afterwards you can add some safety appliances or equipments so that it strengthens, it makes the overall safety architecture more robust. So what we are saying is, see, once we have these disasters, it not only results into the loss of the precious human lives, but also has a very important impact on the overall industrial progress of the country. So we need to basically abide by these laws. We need to provide these laborers and workers the adequate protective equipments so that their lives can be saved, right? Let's have a mains practice question. Despite having a robust legal and institutional framework, the chemical disasters continue to pose serious risks in India. In the light of this statement, critically examine the causes and challenges in managing the chemical disasters. Suggest a comprehensive strategy for the prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer in this question. Now, coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about the undersea cables. Now, we all know that we are critically dependent upon digital connectivity, right? Be it the internet or be it the other modes of communication. But what we often think is that this digital connectivity, it is primarily because of the satellites. But the truth is that more than 90% of this digital connectivity is attributed to the undersea cables. And therefore, the undersea cables are really very important. These are transcontinental cables which are basically lying down on the floor of the oceans and which basically transmit huge amount of data from one place to the other and ultimately help in making the overall digital connectivity more strong. And now India has come up with has added to its resources one more digital cable, right? What we call as the undersea cable. So let's go through this. What this article focuses upon is the issues which are plaguing the development of a more robust undersea cable infrastructure in the country, primarily the regulatory loopholes and the other issues. It's quite an interesting article. India is getting a new cable landing systems coming online gradually. The latest addition is that of Airtel's To Africa Pearls system, which has investments from Facebook parent company Meta, adding 100 terabits of capacity to India's international bandwidth, right? So this is ultimately going to enhance the overall digital connectivity. Now, what are these undersea cables? They are the mainstay. They are the main link of connecting the world's internet networks. They connect the internet service providers and telecom operators. Again, what we need to focus upon is that these cables are few inches thick and they are heavily padded to withstand the hostile environment of the sea floor. Now, again, understand that on the sea floor, we have huge pressure. Also, the environment is very hostile, right? Look at this. So these are the cables which are laid on the floor of the oceans, right? And they have a huge spreading. What we mean to say is that even though the optical fibers, they are quite small, the overall cylindrical area of these optical fibers is quite small. But if you look at the padding, right? So the overall optical fiber has a huge padding. It has a huge cladding, right? Which can protect it from the hostile environment. They provide massive capacity for large volumes of data to quickly crisscross the earth. These systems are critical to the modern information society, and according to our particular estimates, we have almost 600 cables as of now in the overall world. 90% of the data, 80% of the world trade, and about $10 trillion of financial transactions, as well as secure government informations, move through these cables. Can you just understand the importance of these cables? More than 90% of the data, right? And most of the secure transactions, most of the financial transactions, including the government interactions, they are through these cables. That's the impact of the infrastructure has. Each modern cable has several hundred gigabits per second of capacity and can support thousands of telecom users. Now, we have this particular map which showcases the distribution of the cables around the world. Now, if you just look at this particular map, you would see that the density in some areas is quite high. Look at this. We have this area, the East Asian region, right? So we have some of the very technologically advanced countries, be it Japan, South Korea, or some of the commercial centers like Shanghai in China. So therefore, what we see is that we have huge density of cables over here, that it is connecting to the US, right? So we have the cables going to and fro. Then we have the centers like New York being connected to the centers in Europe, right? So we have the cables over here. Then we have these South American cities being connected with these cables. Then we have primarily two centers in India. We have Mumbai and we have Chennai, which are connected to these centers, right? So again, they are very important. In total, there are almost 600 cables, and they are really very important for the overall data transmission, including the financial transactions. Look at this. So we have the optical fiber, right? The optical fiber uses the light energy to basically transmit the data, right? So it has central part, which is the core, then it has a cladding, and then it has a plastic coating, right? So quite an important. Now, if I talk about India, just see, primarily we have Mumbai and we have Chennai over here, which are the two centers, which are the landing stations of these cables in the country. More important, right? Also, we have the development of a particular cable network from that of Chennai to Andaman and Nicobar, and we'll talk about that. Now, what is the functioning? How they basically function? Let's say we have the US over there, and then let's say we have Europe over here, right? So we have a landing station of these cables, and there would be the transitioning. There would be the laying of these cables on the ocean floor. So once you will have shallow sheath, and then you will have deep sea sheath, right? And then it would make a transition, and then ultimately it would go to Europe, laying down on the ocean floor. Ultimately, it would connect through the power feed equipment and optical transmission gear, right? And there is the connection between the European stations and that of the US stations with respect to the digital connectivity. That is how this particular cable works. Now, does India has enough undersea cables? India has two major hubs of cable landing sites, Mumbai and Chennai. 95% of the subsea today goes into a small 6-kilometer patch in Versova in Mumbai. Right, so this is a very important station. In total, 17 cable systems land at some point in India. 2 domestic cable systems, that is Chennai, Andaman, Nicobar Islands. So we have Canny, right? You can see Chennai, Andaman and Nicobar. So it is connecting many of the islands in Andaman and Nicobar to provide high-speed connectivity to the islands, and Kochi Lakshadweep Islands project. Cables take several months, even years to plan out, lay, and at a cost of millions of dollars. So this particular cable, which I'm talking about, the Canny, Chennai, Andaman and Nicobar Islands cable system, will have a speed of 100 gigabits per second. The 8 islands to be connected are these. So you can just have a look in this particular infographic. The capacity may be adequate at this moment of time, but the way the data is growing, one has to keep in mind that the capacity may not be adequate as we go along. What we are trying to say is that we are critically dependent upon the digital technology, right? Digital connectivity, be it for e-commerce, be it for the technological progress in different area. So we need more of digital connectivity, and for that we need more cables. As of now, there are enough number of digital cables, but what we need is the expansion of the infrastructure, and for that we need to lay down more cables. That is what the article is talking about. It is significant to note that India's share presently constitutes almost 1 and 3% respectively for cable landing stations and subsea cable systems. So the share of India, when we talk about the cable landing stations or when we talk about the subsea cable systems, it's quite minuscule when compared to the world, right? Now, what are some of the risks surrounding the undersea cable deployment in India? More cables land in Singapore, a small city state, than they do in all of India, making India vulnerable to the consequence of cable cuts at sea. Singapore is a financial center, right? And therefore, more number of cables are basically laid to Singapore. Now, India has less number of cables. Obviously, it increases its vulnerability. Just before a few days, we had a discussion with respect to a particular instrument, a particular equipment which China has developed. Now, that particular machine is capable of cutting down the cables, going to those depths and cutting down the cables. And that is a strategic threat to different countries, including India. Cuts that brought down the subsea cables in Bab el-Mandeb Strait, likely caused by strikes by the Houthi rebels. So we know that we have a very grim situation in the Red Sea corridor where you have the Houthis attacking US and its allies, primarily because of its support for the Israelis people. And therefore, once you have these Houthi rebels, there is an instance when once they basically attacked, it led to the impact, the irreversible impact on the undersea cables, right? So you can just see, once the cable is attacked, it basically is cut, and therefore the connectivity ends. These cuts have not destabilized India's internet experience so far, thanks to the excess capacity built. If several cables in the Red Sea are damaged, large part of the internet may stop working. Traditionally, most subsea corridors strangely have followed the trade routes of the past, because back in the day, it was easier to follow the trade routes to be able to lay down your cables and make it work. So we had specific trade routes in the past. So most of the cables which are laid down, they follow the same pattern, what this article is talking about. What can be done to bolster, to enhance India's subsea cable infrastructure? Now, we have already understood that these subsea cables are very important. What steps can be taken? Companies laying subsea cables complain of excessive permission needed to land a single cable in India. Almost 51 permissions are needed from various departments. That is our regulatory loophole, right? So we need to basically give emphasis on this fact that we need to provide more smooth regulatory framework. That is really needed. Now, there's a particular example which is given in this article. It says, if we were to lay down almost 8,000 miles of these cables, 80% of the time and effort would go into the 24 miles of territorial waters. What it is trying to say? That almost major amount of time and resources, they would basically be required to seek the permission in the territorial waters. It is not the laying down of these cables on the oceans, which is a major task. What is major task is to get these permissions from different countries. Specifically, it's talking about India. So that is a very serious concern. Streamlining regulations, securing these cables is also important. Fishing trawlers break cables in all the time. So you have these trawlers, they are using these trawlers accidentally. They basically cut these cables and ultimately hampering the digital connectivity. India depends on foreign repair vessels with long permission processes. India currently does not have the requisite subsea cable repair ships. So these are specific ships. You look at this. So we have these equipments which are needed and they're technologically very advanced. So India does not have the requisite number of these ships. And storage depot capacity, more domestic investments in cable repair is needed, right? So ultimately, see, what it is trying to say is that this is a particular sector which is of strategic importance for India. We need to basically provide adequate resources for it. We need to invest in these repair ships. We need to have a more smooth regulatory environment. And again, what we need to focus upon is making sure that these assets are safe, right? And for that, we need to invest adequately in these areas. That is what the article is talking about. Let's go to the next article. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to cloud seeding and natural ionization technology. Now, we have the Delhi Environment Minister. He held meetings with some of the top officials of CPCB, Central Pollution Control Board, and also some of the officials of Delhi State Pollution Control Board, and some of the very senior scientists of IIT Kanpur. Now, what he's saying is that in few months, as we'll transition to winters, there would be a sudden increase in the pollution in the Delhi NCR region. So he's basically looking for different ideas. What can be the different solutions which we can implement so as to reduce the burden of pollution? And according to him, it is affecting the very life of children and citizens living in this particular area. So we need to come up with more innovative ideas. And it is in that regard that we'll talk about the concept of cloud seeding and natural ionization technology. So we have months before the Delhi's annual air pollution emergency erupts in November, Environment Minister held a meeting with relevant agencies to explore the possibility of creating artificial rain through cloud seeding. Officials from CPCB, Delhi Pollution Control Committee, Ministry of Defense, Institute of Tropical Meteorology, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Home Affairs, IIT Kanpur, they basically came and joined the meeting. Rainfall, which is usually brought to Delhi by winter disturbances and winters, washes away the pollutants. So the very objective is that once you have rains in the winter and once you have the rise in the pollution, if you have rains, definitely it washes the pollutants and the atmosphere becomes quite livable. Cloud seeding involves spraying a mixture which includes salts into the cloud using an aircraft. So we'll talk about that to allow the cloud drops to form around the nuclei that the salts provide, and eventually they fall as rain. The process requires flying into the clouds to measure the moisture content and adapt the seeding techniques accordingly. The process is complex and uncertain. IIT Kanpur scientists, which has already held cloud seeding pilot runs, told officials present that the process usually covers hundreds of kilometers and has been used in some parts of the world, right? Trials have not been conducted in winters in Delhi, though trials have been conducted in Kanpur by the IIT Kanpur scientists. We are fighting a war against air pollution in Delhi and are committed to implement all necessary solutions. We are doing this for our children so that they can breathe clean. He also reviewed the presentations on installing the static artificial rain inducting system using natural ionization technology. We'll also talk about that. Now, what happens in cloud seeding is that you have a particular aircraft which is basically flying and it sprays salts into the air. It can be dry ice, it can be silver iodide. What happens is once the salt is sprayed, it basically forms the nuclei over which you have the formation of water droplets. Then it results into the condensation and ultimately you have the rains. That is basically the mechanism. So an aircraft injects the silver iodide or other substances into the atmosphere. Then the chemicals mimic the particles that serve as the surfaces for condensation that creates the water droplets. And then once the condensation creates water droplets that are large enough, they fall as rain. That is the very mechanism of cloud seeding. Now, next thing which is mentioned is natural ionization technology. In this, what happens is, so in the first, we have the cloud seeding and then we have natural ionization technology. We have the towers, which basically release negatively charged ions into the atmosphere. And then these ions act as attracting particles and they form the nuclei over which the rain, the drops, water droplets, they basically accumulate and ultimately it falls as rain. The charged particles attach to the so-called condensation nuclei in the clouds where water droplets form. Ions allow the nuclei to survive longer, giving water droplets more time to grow, right? So this is what the natural ionization technology is all about, and that is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's go to the next article. Coming to the next article, this is with respect to the country of Hungary. Now, we have the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who has said that we are going to welcome Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And again, this is in that light where you have the International Criminal Court, which has already issued a warrant against Mr. Netanyahu. And what the Hungarian Prime Minister has said is that we are going to withdraw from the ICC and therefore International Criminal Court becomes important. We'll have a comparative analysis. We'll try to see how it is different from the International Court of Justice, right? ICJ and International Criminal Court. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived in Hungary's capital to red carpet treatment despite a warrant for his arrest issued by the world's top war crime court. Hungary's government and its Prime Minister, we have Viktor Orban, has announced that it will begin the procedure of withdrawing from the International Tribunal, the International Criminal Court. Now, see, this is what you need to understand, that what is the difference between ICJ, the International Court for Justice, and the International Criminal Court. Now, this is the International Court of Justice is a particular arm, an organ of the United Nations, and this is not directly related to the United Nations. That is what you need to understand. So, the ICJ is a part and parcel of United Nations. ICC is not. It established in 1946 and it was established in 2002. Now, authority derived from, so it is primarily derived from the UN Charter, and those states who are party to the UN Charter automatically becomes party to the ICJ. Non-UN member state can also become parties to the ICJ by ratifying the ICJ statute. What is the basis of the formation of ICC, International Criminal Court? So we had the Rome Statute signed by 139 countries and 123 have ratified it. India is not a signatory to the Rome Statute and therefore it is not a party to ICC. Relationship with UN, official code of UN, and this is independent. But again, one thing is very important. Let's say you have a particular country which is not a party to ICC. Now, there is a jurisdiction of ICC that only those countries who are a party to ICC, it can only respond or it can only prosecute those individuals from those states. But can a person who is from a particular state, who is from a particular country, which is not a party to ICC, can the ICC prosecute that individual? The answer is yes. How is that possible? If the United Nations Security Council basically recommends to the ICC that please prosecute this individual. And that was seen in the case of Libya and Sudan. Do remember. Headquarters in The Hague, Netherlands, the same. Type of code, it's civil code, it's a criminal code. Understand, when we talk about the International Code of Justice, the parties are the states. That you must know. It cannot basically prosecute an individual. It can only prosecute a particular state. Jurisdiction, United Nations member states, and the jurisdiction with respect to the ICC is the individual. Scope of work, legal disputes between the parties, provides advisory opinions, criminal prosecution of individuals, right? So in this case, we have Benjamin Netanyahu, against whom the warrant has been issued by the ICC. Subject matter, so what are the subject matter dealt by the ICJ? Sovereignty, boundary disputes, maritime disputes, trade, natural resources, human rights, treaty violations, etc. Over here, there are different types of crimes which are looked by the ICC. Genocides, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression. Funding, funded by the UN, and it is funded by the parties who are basically to the ICC. Contribution from the state parties to the Rome Statute, voluntary contributions from the UN, international organizations, individuals, corporations, etc. Nature of judgment, it's binding on the member states. ICC rulings are not bindings on any state except parties. So those who are parties, on them they are binding, right? And that's the reason you have this particular Viktor Orban who has said that we are going to come out of the ICC, right? Because if there'll be a party to ICC, they'll have to abide by its directive. That you must understand. Is India a member? So India is a member of ICJ, but not ICC. That is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's go to the next article. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, we already studied in the very first article about the economic nationalism being practiced by Donald Trump. Many times, he also gave a hint that he's not really interested in NATO. And this rattled and this created panic among different countries, European countries, primarily because of their proximity with Russia. See, again, NATO was constituted to basically counter the aggressions of erstwhile USSR. And its successor state, now we have Russia. But when US says that it is not really interested in NATO, that sends a very strong signal to these European countries. And why Donald Trump said this was because he wanted different European countries to increase their spending upon NATO. That is what he wanted, right? So we have the Secretary of State of US who has said that US president is not basically willing to come out of NATO. He's really interested to be in NATO, provided different countries are contributing effectively to the overall funds. That is the news, right? US Secretary of State Marco Rubio told nervous NATO members on Thursday that Washington remained committed to the alliance, but said they must agree to massively ramp up the spending targets for defense. President Donald Trump has rattled Europe by casting doubt on its willingness to defend all allies and by reaching out to Russia over the war in Ukraine. This is also an added factor that without even consulting Europe, President Donald Trump directly interacted with Russia. And that has also created panic among different European countries before further raising tensions with its latest trade tariffs. President Trump's made clear that he supports NATO. We are going to remain in NATO. That has been said by Secretary of State. Mr. Trump has demanded that the alliance more than double its current spending target to 5% of GDP, more than any, including Washington, right, which spend now. What is NATO? Founded in 1949, primarily to counter, already told you, primarily to counter the expansion, the aggressiveness of USSR. With the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty or Washington Treaty. Remember, the other name is Washington Treaty, do remember, because UPSC has had this habit of exploiting these areas. With the aim of acting as a deterrent to the threat of Soviet expansion in the Europe after World War II. Headquarters in Brussels, that is in Belgium. NATO is a political and military alliance of 32 countries. Latest country which was added was Sweden. Remember, countries from Europe and North America founded on the principles of collective defense. Attack on one is attack on all. That is what collective defense is all about. If one NATO ally is attacked, then all NATO allies are attacked. So far, Article 5 has been invoked only once, and that was in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Founding members, you can just have a look. Sweden joined in March 24, Finland joined in 2023. Now, purpose, NATO provides a unique link between the Europe and North America, the transatlantic link. That's the reason we call it North Atlantic Treaty Organization, enabling them to consult and cooperate in the fields of defense, security, and strategic areas, and conduct multinational crisis management operations together, right? Funding, every NATO country contributes to the cost of running the alliance based on a cost share formula derived from gross national income. So, as a percent of gross national income, you have to contribute to the NATO. That is what the Donald Trump is also saying, that please increase your contributions. Otherwise, NATO would become ineffective. That is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's go to the last article of the day. So coming to the last article of the day, we have the Axiom 4 mission. So we have Indian astronaut, Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla, who is going to be a part of this Axiom 4 mission, right? So it's a very important news. Indian astronaut Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla's mission to the International Space Station will take place in May 2025. Shukla will be the pilot of the upcoming Axiom 4 mission, which is the 4th private astronaut mission to the ISS. Remember, it's a private mission. Group Captain Shukla, who is also one of the 4 astronaut designates selected for the Gaganyaan mission of ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, will be the first Indian astronaut to go to the International Space Station and the first Indian to go to space in the last 40 years. Very important feat, very big achievement for India. AX4, Axiom 4, is the 4th private astronaut mission to the ISS, International Space Station, organized by Axiom Space in collaboration with NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The AX4 crew will launch aboard the SpaceX Dragon space aircraft. Do remember, right? To the ISS from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Once docked, the private astronauts plan to spend almost 14 days on board the ISS. During the time aboard, the crew will conduct scientific experiments, perform technology demonstrations, and engage in educational outreach. Research areas include material science, biology, Earth observation, and more, with the potential to yield groundbreaking discoveries and innovations. The mission will send the first Indian astronaut to the station as a part of the joint effort between NASA and Indian Space Agency. The private mission also carries the first astronauts from Poland, Hungary to stay aboard the International Space Station. So we have Mr. Shubhanshu Shukla, Group Captain Shubhanshu Shukla, who is going to be a member of this particular mission. That's all for today. I hope you really enjoyed the session. If you really did, do let us know through likes and comments. Thank you. All the very best.